All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Daily Dose of Awesome, which is 15 minutes of inspiration, motivation, and education so you can get your day going right. Again, I hope you're having a fantastic day so far. And I want to start with a question for you, and that is, have you ever left your house and say you're driving down the road and you think, gosh, did I lock the door? And you cannot remember whether or not you lock the door. And occasionally, this happens to me sometimes, occasionally it might even bug you enough where you turn around and go back and check and make sure that you did in fact lock the door because you have no memory of doing that, right? Other instances might be you're running some errands, and before you know it, you've wound up, you're back home, you've arrived, and you think, oh gosh, the one thing that I went out to get, I did not get, and I just kind of like autopiloted my way back home, and this happens to me. We're getting some comments too. Oh, you leave it unlocked. Okay, that's one strategy. You would not have to you'd not have to worry about that if you consistently left your door unlocked. Anyway, there's actually a term for it. It's called highway hypnosis, when we're essentially out in the world and we're just kind of like operating on autopilot. Because there are two parts. For the sake of this argument, there are two areas of the brain. And a lot of times we think of brain as being like right brain and left brain. And while that is a useful distinction in some contexts, there's another kind of dual like bifurcation of the brain, which is sort of the older parts of the brain, which are the reptilian parts of the brain, as they're so called, and the newer, more mammalian parts of the brain, right? You know, your frontal lobes and all the other more newer and more sophisticated structures that go along with being a mammalian and having the kind of the higher orders of thought that we do. And so these two areas of the brain do two kind of different things, right? Your older, more reptilian parts of your brain, those control things that you aren't necessarily always consciously aware of. They are like essentially, we're not making a conscious effort most of the time to breathe, yet we successfully are able to do so, right, even while sleeping. And all these kind of automatic non-conscious behaviors, that's all stuff that your reptilian brain is doing, while the newer stuff, the stuff that's happening in the mammalian parts of your brain, that's kind of what you're consciously aware of, and when you're consciously processing and thinking. And of course, we have a very sort of limited attention, so it's a fantastic thing that we don't have to consciously try to breathe and do all these other things, because there's no way we'd be able to manage all of that. So these two things, they're working together and sometimes tugging at one another, right? These kind of two areas of our brain, and some interesting things happen, and there's some things that happen that aren't, of course, a part of our conscious experience, right? There's some things that we're doing on autopilot. Again, highway hypnosis when you're driving around is a great example. But there are things that we're doing that we're not consciously paying attention to. And one of the kind of interesting effects is all of the kind of subtle triggers and nudges that can happen without us having any idea, right? So I'll give you an example. There was kind of a cool study that was done, and the experimenters, they brought all of the participants into a room, and they had the participants share an experience that where they had done something essentially unethical, where they had done something morally questionable in their past. And so they had them recount this experience, share it with the experimenters, and then this is where the participants were divided essentially into the experimental group and the control group. So the experimental group was then instructed to wash their hands, and the control group was not given that instruction. So there was a little sink essentially in the corner of this room. And again, the experimental group, so half of the participants, washed their hands, and then upon leaving, all of the participants, who of course did all this not at the same time, they were doing this privately, upon leaving, they were approached by a desperate graduate student who really needed someone to help to participate in their research project, and they weren't going to be able, usually when you participate in an experiment, there's some kind of perk, right? Maybe they give you a Subway gift card, or, a couple dollars, or, there's some kind of like perk. But this experimenter says, hey, I'm sorry, I can't pay you anything, but I desperately need your help. Now, what was interesting is that the group that did not, so essentially the control group, the group that did not wash their hands, were twice as likely to comply with this request. In the experimental group, the group that had washed their hands, again, was half as likely to help this poor, desperate graduate student out with their research. So the experimenters, and you can kind of see there's kind of that immediate correlation of, right, washing your hands, right, and kind of washing your hands. I think of like Pontius Pilate, right, washing your hands and being done with something, right? So they'd done something morally questionable, but they'd washed their hands of that experience and that memory, and they'd essentially moved on. So that's an effect that, again, that's completely non-conscious. We're not aware of the fact that that's happening, but it is influencing our behavior. Now there are other cues, right? Like retail spaces have learned quite a bit about how to cue us up to spend more money. So, right, when you walk into a grocery store, chances are really strong. The first thing that you're going to encounter is the bakery. There might even be a hot bar, and then there's likely flowers and produce, right? So you're going to kind of immediately walk into a very stimulating area that smells really good, and that's been demonstrated to increase the amount of food that you purchase while shopping. Retail spaces have been heavily studied over the years because obviously we've been doing retail for a long time, and there's quite a bit of money, of course, to be made and lost from a optimized versus non-optimized retail setting. So there's a lot of cool research that's gone into optimizing retail spaces. I'll give you one example that's kind of funny. There's an effect called the butt bump, and pretty much the way the butt bump works is they found that women, perhaps understandably, their likelihood of buying and making a purchase and essentially spending more time in a particular store is essentially inversely proportional to whether or not they are bumped on the bottom while examining the merchandise. So here's how this works. So say you're at a store and you're sifting through the rack, right? Maybe there's a stack of sweaters and you're trying to find your size. You're bending over to do that, right? Like you've got the display up here, and then you've got the racks of clothes, and you're probably bending over. So what you don't want to happen is to have someone jostle you from behind while you're performing that activity, right? Because that's uncomfortable and unexpected. And so what they found is that they can optimize retail spaces catering to women by creating more room essentially in the aisles, so that there's less likelihood of there being one of these butt bump situations that causes people to exit the premises and not spend any money. So if you were to go into any kind of little boutique, whether it's Talbot's or Ann Taylor or one of those kind of stores, what you're likely going to find is much more aisle space and much more breathing room than you would if you were to go into, say, a men's Brooks Brothers or something, right? Because that's just that's not an effect that is pertinent to the male crowd. So that's another kind of retail optimization that's happening. They've done some other cool studies as well. Actually, they're a ton, and what we're describing, we'll get to that in a second. I'll tell you one more fun one quickly, and that is you can actually affect the speed at which someone walks simply by priming them with certain words. So they performed an experiment where using the word bingo, right? The participants would be in a room where they would see the word bingo, and that would be the control group, the experimental group. The control group would not see the word bingo. And the folks that were exposed to the word bingo, which we typically associate with an older crowd, those folks would walk more slowly down the hallway. So they actually timed folks as they were walking to the room where the experiment was taking place, and they timed them leaving and walking and exiting down the hallway. And again, what they found, there was a significant difference in the folks that were exposed to the term bingo, because again, it's associated with with a more elderly crowd, and that just primed the participants to move more slowly. They've also shown that endurance can be affected simply by seeing a performance beverage, right? So this was another study they did. I say they, like there's some kind of day. But anyway, these are all studies that are coming out of universities all around the world. But anyway, there was another study that showed that the experimental group which was exposed to a sports beverage, like a Gatorade, had more endurance, essentially, than a group that was exposed to just water, right? So these things are essentially, it's called priming, and these things are all around us, these non-conscious influences. Because again, they're two parts of our brain, and we're only, barely conscious, right, of what essentially our conscious mind is doing. And we have, of course, no conscious control or really awareness of what our non-conscious or unconscious brain is doing. But it's affecting us. It's all the time. It's there with us. It's perceiving, and it's controlling a lot of our behavior. And we perhaps don't give it enough credit. We don't tend to think that that's the case, but it truly is. And so this effect is called priming. And again, priming is any time that you're essentially being influenced by something external, some kind of cue that sort of nudges and affects your behavior. So here is my little tip for you today, because this is happening all the time. This is just a part of our experience. So I say, how about have a certain amount of control yourself over what you are being primed by? Now, there are certain, I've read certain studies that have suggested that certain colors are very conducive to creativity. Greens and blues, for instance, are very conducive to creativity. And I actually personally find that taking a walk, they've actually shown, this is actually not an effective priming, but just getting out and taking a walk and getting your blood flow going, right? Because your brain essentially, it burns a lot of calories, and it requires quite a bit of blood flow to be working in an optimal space, right? So I like to take a walk, and we have a river trail, which I like to walk on, because again, that blue, I find, and I think a lot of people will agree that water is quite calming and conducive to creativity. So I like to take a walk before I'm about to do anything that involves, creativity, inspiration, or especially when I'm going to be writing copy, whether that's an ad, whether it's a blog post, whether it's an email. I like to put myself in an optimal condition. And this doesn't have to be like an extremely laborious thing, but just a quick, brisk 10, 15-minute walk can really kind of reset, right? And so while you're on that walk, there's a couple other things I'd like to suggest. And again, this is kind of my process. It's just a little trick. It works very well for me, and this is really simple stuff. I'm not going to be telling you anything particularly revolutionary here, but it works for me. One thing that I particularly like to do, beyond just kind of setting a nice context, taking a walk, is I like to essentially prime myself. I like to kind of fill up and cue up my vocabulary and just kind of my entire psyche, my entire sort of way of thinking with pertinent material to whatever I'm working on. Because you've probably heard it said before that, the most terrifying place that you can begin any kind of creative endeavor is essentially the blank page, or the empty canvas, or the blank screen that's staring at you. And so that's not really where I like to start. I kind of like to begin with a bit of inspiration. So as an example, I have a webinar tonight, actually, by the way, if you guys aren't signed up. If you aren't currently a member of Elite Marketing Pro, then you're missing out, and you should definitely check out what we have going on here at Elite Marketing Pro in our community. But if you are a member, then just go into either our Facebook or Google community, and you can see the registration link for tonight's webinar. It's going to be with the one and only Kate McShay, and Kate's going to be sharing how to create a really effective and profitable social media calendar, essentially an editorial calendar for all of your efforts on social media. So that's happening tonight, and I bring it up partially because you should definitely be there. It's going to be an awesome presentation, 9 p.m. Eastern tonight. Again, check your email or check the communities for the registration link. But to promote this webinar, right, I was writing emails, and one of the things that I particularly like to do when writing emails is check out other emails, right? Like I like to read a couple of really strong direct response emails to just kind of prime the pump of my creativity, just to kind of get me in the right mindset. And I find, even though I've literally written hundreds and hundreds of emails over the years, that just kind of getting into that mindset, it takes a minute. There's kind of like a warm-up process. So what I like to do is there's a Vitali is a fantastic email marketer. You could read a couple of Vitali's emails, and it particularly pay attention to the subject lines and kind of the tone. There's kind of a particular, how shall we say, there's almost like a mode. There's a direct response mode, if you will, where there's just a particular tone that you take, and sometimes, and different email marketers do it in different ways. Ben Settle is someone who has, we've had it No Excuses in the past. He's a fantastic email marketer, and he has a particularly strong kind of, gosh, what's the best word? He just has a very strong personality, and his emails are written with quite a bit of his strong personality. And again, there's kind of a certain tone that he sort of achieves with everything in his marketing. And that's, of course, you don't want to necessarily emulate him exactly, but just getting into that mindset. You could read a couple of his emails if you're on his list, and if you're not, it's definitely some good copy to check out. If email marketing is something that you're doing and focusing on, definitely recommend being on Ben's list. And so just reading a couple of his emails will help kind of put you in the right mindset and mind frame. Similarly, again, reading Vitali's emails here at Elite Marketing Pro. If you're promoting our products, which you probably are, reading a couple of Vitali's emails and just kind of getting a feel for, okay, how is it that I need to frame this conversation? What does that need to kind of look like and feel like? So just kind of, you're just priming yourself. You're getting yourself in the right frame of mind. This is also true for writing blog posts. There's a prolific blogger named Neil Patel, not really in our space, but in kind of the larger entrepreneurial community. And Neil Patel puts out these epic blog posts pretty much every single day. Again, just really a prolific amount of content coming out. He's a founder of Kissmetrics, which is a metrics company that we actually use internally here at Elite Marketing Pro. Sophisticated stuff, not really anything that would be pertinent to you guys. But anyway, just kind of as an FYI. But whenever I'm writing a blog post, particularly when I'm writing my title, because again, when you're writing an email, the subject line is the most important part of that email, and when you're writing a blog post, the title is the most important part of your blog post. That's the thing that most people, right, probably 80% of everyone, they're just going to see the title, or they're just going to see the subject line, right? Because the vast majority of people do not open, right? And the vast majority of people do not click, right? So that's the thing most people are seeing, so that's what you really want to optimize. So when I'm writing a blog title, the first thing that I do, I actually have a filter that I've set up in my email so that I can go and check out my Neil Patel folder, and I'll just quickly read through 20, 50 titles of his blog posts, just to kind of, I'm not necessarily copying any of them word for word. I'm just getting myself in the right mindset. And I'm priming myself with the kind of terminology and the kind of structure, right? There's a grammar to all of this. There's a grammar to an email subject line. There is a grammar to a blog post title, and pretty much any other kind of creative that you might be working on. There's just kind of a certain tone that you want to be achieving. And again, the easiest way to do that is to immerse yourself. It could be a quick process, but you want to just immerse yourself in that experience and immerse yourself in that kind of environment and context before you set about to be doing something creative of your own. I see Jules just joined. Jules, how are you today? Jules could probably back me up here. Jules is a fantastic designer, and Jules and I worked together for many, many years. Love you, Jules. And I'm sure I've never done graphic design. I've never, done anything visually creative like that. I'm much more of a writer and an editor. But Jules probably has some ads and some visually stimulating things that she likes to sort of prime her creative pump with before she sits down and starts working on a project, whether it's a magazine or a banner or whatever else, right? There's kind of our little pool of creativity that we like to kind of tap into. So that's kind of what I want you guys to think about is, instead of being in the situation, I was actually just having a conversation the other week with a gentleman who's actually a very talented writer. That's kind of the part that that's an important key to this story. This guy he's a great writer. He has a great kind of feel for storytelling and lacing his writing with interesting tidbits and factoids that really engage the reader. But he often suffers from a creative block. He often just kind of sits down, stares at the page, and just doesn't know how to move forward, doesn't know how to create any kind of momentum. And so again, the best way to do that is to not start from that blank page, but to start from a place of inspiration, start from a place. Copywriters have something they often call their swipe file, and the swipe file is just a collection of really effective improvement ads that have been used in the past. Because guys, here's the thing, and I never ever of course would suggest any sort of plagiarism or any kind of unethical behavior. That's just not cool, and that should sort of go without saying. But creativity in general is sort of overrated, right? And I'm not of the opinion that everything that's ever been said has already been said before. I'm close, but I'm not 100% of that opinion. But most of the things that are even very popular, right, kind of aren't necessarily all that creative. Despite how they might look on the surface. I mean, take the biggest, I think, blockbuster of the past couple years was Star Wars movies, right? So think about the what was it, the Force Awakens? It was the one that came out, no, not this past one, but the one before that. It literally made I forget, over $1 billion or something, 1.2 or $3 billion, something like that. Anyway, a very profitable film, a film that certainly ranks I believe in the top 20 of all-time box office gross. But the film was extremely derivative. I mean, obviously it was enjoyable, of course. I think everyone who saw it probably enjoyed themselves and had a good time. But it really was almost just a remix of the first Star Wars film that came out, back in 1977. And even to that point, the first Star Wars film, which, again, don't get me wrong, one of my favorite movies, really, really great stuff. The first Star Wars film was very much based on George Lucas's enjoyment of a few things. He loved Westerns. He loved Akira Kurosawa, who did the samurai movies that, again, were heavily influenced by Westerns. And he also loved airplane aviation, dogfighting, kind of World War II and World War I movies, right? So what he did is he sort of took these sources of inspiration, the samurai stuff, the Western stuff, and the dogfighting planes from World War II, and of course made a really cool synthesis of those things and added a layer of Joseph Campbell's mythology and some of his own material onto that as well, with the Jedi and the Force and lightsabers. A lot of cool stuff going on there. But again, he didn't start from scratch. This is not something where he's starting with a total blank slate and just all of this pours out, right? There are some very serious influences, and there are even a lot of scenes from the original Star Wars that are taken from his favorite movies. So there are a lot of scenes that are the way the scene is constructed and set up and the whole deal. I don't know any necessarily off the top of my head. You can look this stuff up if you're curious. But there are a lot of scenes that are just straight out of his favorite movies. He's paying homage to his favorite films. And so anyway, this is something that's part of the creative process. It's something that everybody does, and it's something that I encourage you guys to kind of work on as a part of your process. What really gets you in the right mindset and frame of mind to produce your best work. And again, for me, I like taking a little walk, getting the blood flowing, and looking over some relevant material to whatever I'm going to be working on. Which again, in this past week was, of course, blog posts and emails. So that's my tip, my little trick for you today, is to essentially take a certain amount of control over what's influencing you, right? You're being influenced all of the time. Your non-conscious mind is constantly being influenced by the environment. So take a little bit of control over that, and you don't necessarily need to know exactly how this process of creativity is working, but don't have it be a passive process. Get really active in controlling the influences that are shaping and really queuing up everything that you're going to be working on, and again, sort of priming your vocabulary and kind of priming that context and that tone that you want to achieve. And this is true for everything: emails, blog posts, ads, videos. Matter of fact, I probably should have watched a Daily Dose of Awesome before doing this Daily Dose of Awesome, just again to kind of get me in the appropriate mind frame and mindset to do this. So anyway, that's my trick for you today. Guys, that's how you can really prime that pump of creativity and inspiration, and that's what's really going to make everything that you're doing that much more engaging and effective. So with that, I hope you have a fantastic Thursday. We'll see you around. And don't forget to join my webinar tonight. Check your email, check our communities, get registered. It's going to be awesome.